group policy, modeling and results. Although group policy isn't an overly complex thing to understand, it can become complex once you have a lot of policies to contend with, especially when those policies are nested deep inside a multiple OU hierarchy. Remember that policies are applied in the order of local policies first, followed by site policies, then domain policies, OU policies, and then any child OUs. Now you could have child OUs running several levels deep with a mixture of block inheritance and enforced policy settings, and you can probably see how it all becomes a nightmare to find out what really is the end result to the objects that are applying any given policy. In Windows 2008, we've got two features that can assist us with this problem: the Group Policy Modeling Wizard and Group Policy Results. The Group Policy Modeling, that's a utility that helps us find out what effect a policy will have on a target before we apply it, as it lets us simulate the results we'd expect to get without actually having to make a live change on our network. And that's really useful since it can prevent all sorts of problems from occurring by letting us find out what's going to happen if we do make changes. Group Policy Results, on the other hand, is a tool that we can use to find out what policies are already being applied to a target without having to go out and find this sort of information out manually. So it's useful because it takes the complexity out of the equation. You don't have to figure things out anymore, just run the tool and it'll tell you, after all of the different policies have been applied to a target, what the end result will be. So let's go and take a look at these two really useful features of group policy. So we'll click on Start, we'll select Administrative Tools, and we'll launch the Group Policy Management Console. Now we'll expand our forest on the left here, winstructorlab.com, and down the bottom here we have the two options that we're looking for: Group Policy Modeling and Group Policy Results. Now at present, both of these containers here will be blank, so let's look at the modeling option first, which is what we'll use to simulate how a policy change will affect the target that we'll be applying it against. So we'll right click on Group Policy Modeling and we'll choose the Group Policy Modeling Wizard, which, as you'd expect, will start up the Group Policy Modeling Wizard, so we'll click Next. Now by default this will run against the current domain, which is winstructorlab.com, but from this drop down list here you can select any other domains that you have in your forest, so I could run this against my London or New York subdomains if I like. Now down the bottom here we can also choose which domain controller we want to run this simulation against, and since all your domain controllers should be identical, it's not important which one you choose if you have multiple of it, but if you have some that are busier than others, you might want to decide to run it against a domain controller that isn't so busy. Right, well I'm just going to run this against my domain, winstructorlab.com, and I'll let the wizard choose any domain controller and we'll click Next. Now when we create group policy objects, we have two targets for our policy, either users or computers. So in this screen we can select our targets for this simulation. Now under the user information section we can either target this simulation against a container like an OU or a user account. Now under our computer information heading we've got the same options, a container and a computer account. So let's run this against an OU that I have in this domain called Head Office, which has a user account in it called Tim. So under our user information heading we'll select container and then click Browse. We'll expand our domain, we'll choose our Head Office OU and click on OK. Now if the policy that we do want to simulate also has computer policies configured, we could also add in another OU or a computer account to test if we like. Now if you don't want to see all of the other screens in this wizard, we can also skip right down to the end of the wizard if we like, but since we'll want to see everything, we won't be doing that right now. We'll just click Next. Now we can also choose to simulate a slow network connection, like a dial-up connection as well if we like, and that's a rather useful option to consider, because when we're dealing with a slow link, certain policies won't be applied, such as when we use policies to install applications. So if that's the sort of policy that you want to simulate, you can use this option as well. Now we also have an option here for Loopback Processing, which is an advanced setting that doesn't process group policy objects in the local, site, domain and OU order that we've talked about in the past, with loopback processing, we have two modes, replace mode and merge mode. Replace mode replaces the normal GPOs that you'd expect the user to get with the GPO list that's already been obtained by the computer at startup. However, in merge mode, the GPO list for the computer is concatenated, or if you like, added to the GPO list that's obtained for the user when logging in. And because the computer GPO is applied last, it will, and this is the only time by the way, it'll override the user's GPOs. Now we can also test this simulation against a site as well if you like, but since I only have the one default site in our list, I'm not going to use it in this instance, so we'll move on by clicking next. Now here we can simulate what happens when group membership changes. So what would happen if our user Tim, who's a member of the head office OU we're testing now, was added to another group such as the domain administrators group or the enterprise administrators group? Well, to answer that question, we can simply click on Add and then locate the group that we're thinking about adding Tim's account to. And now we have the option of simulating exactly what will happen when Tim's group membership is changed. So if we click Advanced and we'll click Find Now. Now, I will point out that even if we do add Tim to another group here, this won't actually change Tim's group membership, of course. We are in simulation mode, so feel free to whack Tim in as many groups as you like. It won't do any harm. It'll just take longer to process the query. Alright, so let's add him to the domain admins group and we'll click on OK and then OK again. So go ahead and make any choices that you like. Now if you do get carried away here and you add in too many and you've forgotten what groups Tim was originally a member of, you can click on the Restore Default button here and Tim's normal group membership will then be displayed. Alright, well we'll click Next. And finally here we can also link WMI Filters to this query. Now this is not only useful for testing your potential policy changes, but also for testing your WMI scripts. Now you might have installed a script that checks for a certain amount of RAM, say 512 meg of RAM that must be installed in the computer. Now you might think that Tim has at least 512 meg of RAM, well you can test it to be sure. You could use this option to add additional WMI filters to test practically any sort of configuration that you like. Now, since my installation here is pretty much a default one, I won't actually have any filters, so we don't have anything to add here. But to add one, we can click on Only These Filters and then click on the List Filters button. And in a moment, we'll get back a list of all the filters that we've created, and then you can just select one from the list. Okay, well we won't add any of those in here. We'll click Next. And here we'll get our summary screen. So if everything looks good, we'll click Next again. And we'll start the query, and then our progress bar is going to kick into action, telling us that our query is gathering some information behind the scenes. Alright, we're done, our query's complete, so we'll click Finish. And now we can see our head office OU listed at the top of our report and all of the user configuration options down the bottom. So now we can go through this report, which details the group policy settings that we'll be applying to any user in the head office OU. So this is a really cool and useful feature of group policy, and I'd recommend that you use it before you actually implement any new policy changes. That way you're going to see how it's going to look before you make a live and potentially catastrophic change to your environment. Alright, well the other feature that we're going to take a look at in this video is the group policy results. So we'll right click on that and we'll open up a group policy results wizard, which starts up the wizard of course, so we'll click Next. Okay, now we can select which computer we want to display policy settings for, and that defaults to this computer, which may or may not be what you want, where you can select another computer and then browse for one. So we'll click Advanced and then Find Now, and we'll simulate what would happen if our user Tim here logs on to our second domain controller, DC02. So we'll click on OK, and OK again, and then we'll click Next. Alright. Now this wizard here will now identify what user accounts are associated with the machine in question. Now do note here that this list only shows users that have already logged onto the computer, in which case the only account thus far is the administrator account. So we'll use the administrator account for this test, although we can choose to not display any user policy settings if we like, but we'll leave the default as it is. We'll click Next. And we've got our summary here, so we'll click Next, and then the wizard is going to go off and gather the results. Okay, it's done. It's pretty quick, so we'll click Finish. And then we'll get a report here of, in this case, the administrator's policy on our server DCO2. So, like before, we can dig down into this report and we can find out what policies we'll be applying to the administrator account when we log on to DCO2. So if we expand one of these, let's say Group Policy Objects here, and then we'll expand Applied GPOs, we can see here that the administrator account is applying the default domain policy. And of course, since this is a domain controller, it's also applying the default domain controller's policy. So this tool becomes really useful. Say for argument's sake, we just applied another policy to the administrator's account and it's not showing up here. Well, then we have a problem. So we could use this tool to troubleshoot group policy and find out why the administrator account isn't applying the policy. Perhaps we'd put a WMI filter in there which filters out his machine. Or maybe we configured the policy to deny certain groups from applying the policy, in which case it would be listed here under Deny GPOs. Whatever the case may be, this is a really useful tool for finding out how our users and computers are affected by our choice of policies. So in this video, we've talked about the really useful group policy tools, the Group Policy Modeling Wizard and the Group Policy Results Wizard. When designing policies, you should consider using these modeling wizards first to simulate what effect policy changes and changes to the target, for example, moving them onto a new OU or adding them to a group is going to have. And doing this before you actually make that change will help you to identify any problems you may have before you actually implement the new policy. The Group Policy Results Wizard, on the other hand, can assist you in troubleshooting problems with policies that aren't applying to a target when you think they should be working, and it can help you identify where the problem may lie. It's also a useful tool for just simply finding out what policies are applying to a target, and that can be nice to know for future reference. So we hope you've enjoyed this video and would like to thank you for supporting Winstructor.